Hello and welcome to The Divide, a podcast in which a psychologist and a group of communication scholars get together to discuss our culture's current state of division. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. And tonight we discuss the QAnon phenomenon as depicted in HBO's documentary Q Into the Storm and the Amazon Prime documentary QAnon, The Search for Q. Gentlemen, please tell us who you are and tell us how you feel your expertise will contribute to our understanding of the QAnon phenomenon. And I'll start with Dr. Stephen Hunt.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Hunt. I'm the director of the School of Communication, and I have a pretty intense interest in persuasion and understanding things like how misinformation spreads through society, including through legacy media and new social media. I'm just fascinated by the processes by which people communicate about the things that they're passionate about, and sometimes communicate things that are clearly misinformation, right? And how that spreads.
Fantastic. Dr. Nathan Carpenter.
I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I'm the Director of Convergent Media for the School of Communication at Illinois State. And I contribute mostly through bringing data to the conversation. So I can go out and collect social media data. And in fact, tonight we'll be looking at a little bit more of, I guess, digital media related to the QAnon phenomenon. There's so much in the social world right now that it's just overwhelming. So I've picked out a couple of key points that I think will drive conversation using some tools that any of you out there who are watching and listening in that you can use along as well, including some cable TV analyzers and Google Trends as a pretty simple tool, but something that'll give you a pretty complex picture as to what's happening.
Fantastic. Dr. Byron Craig.
Hi, I'm Dr. Craig, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Communication. And I think for me, what I think I'm bringing to this conversation this evening in my area of research is race and rhetoric. And as I watched this again for the second time, I was really found myself interested in notions of racism with Q, and even with the making of this documentary in a sense. There's some things that really caught my attention, that really kind of bothered me, and some things I'll bring up this evening when we think about this whole phenomena and even with the documentary itself.
Oh, that's fantastic. Dr. Steve Rahko.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Steve Rahko, and I teach at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. I'm trained as a rhetorical critic. So I think what I'd like to bring to this conversation is a sense of how we can understand the QAnon phenomena discursively and mythically. I'm interested in thinking about how this intersects with larger discourses about race, as Dr. Craig alluded to as well. So I'm looking forward to dissecting this from our kind of scholarly lenses here this evening.
Fantastic. As a psychologist, I'm interested in the phenomenology of QAnon, what it feels like to be a member of QAnon. Of course, I can only speculate. At the same time, being a social being, I know there are social feelings I have when I'm connected to a group. So I want to try to understand the group through that lens, the rhetoric through that lens, and how they create a world that grants them importance and agency, and how that might relate to what we do. So Nathan, please go ahead and show us the data.
Yep, absolutely. I'll get my screen share going here. I'm going to open up a couple of windows. And Again, these are things, most of what I'm going to show during this talk are things that anybody can use, and I think will be helpful and pretty interesting. So first thing I'm going to pop up here is the Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer, which is the service of Stanford University. And I'll just do a search so you can see what it looks like when you find it here. So Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer. All right, so you're looking for tvnews.stanford.edu, and it defaults, imagine that when we're thinking about discourse here, right? Like it defaults to Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, right? So kind of interesting there. And that even of itself is an interesting switch, just take a look at how that changes. And what you're looking at here is the number of minutes per month dedicated to Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN. And they actually collect they collect cable TV news shows through the Internet Archive and then scan the transcripts and make all that searchable in a database. It's a really, really cool thing. And then here's what's really neat. You can actually go in here and click on these on a date and a time range, and it will pull up. I mean, watch this. This is the coolest thing ever. It does facial recognition, so it can pull up people that are either, like again, right there, the name Joe Biden like showed up in the transcript or something like that. Name Donald Trump showed up in the transcript, and it tries to find other people too. So you'll see all these initials that are also available in the database, and you can just keep going through these. And when you click on them, it'll actually pull up the video, and you can see the exact context of that conversation. So really, really rich stuff. So I didn't bring this up though for the sake of showing off, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. I brought it up because not only can you do, names and people and stations, you can also do text queries. So here's one right here. I'm going to type in text equals and in quotes, just QAnon, just for a broad spectrum of what's happening, right? And again, this is the emergence, or at least it's probably not everything, right? Like we don't have all of cable TV news, but it is the big ones that most people are watching: MSNBC, Fox, and CNN, right? And so again, what we know, of course, about QAnon is it doesn't really take off as a conspiracy until 2018, right? So no surprise, that we see just the first news reports right there in August, which is quite a while after all that. But let's pull that up real quick just to see some of the stations. And it looks like most of that is CNN. We've got some MSNBC in here. It says there's only 28 videos, so not a whole lot. Not a whole lot going on. There we go. Next. And let me see right there. It's saying a total of 1.5 minutes overall. So not a ton of coverage. And again, it looks like it's mostly CNN, NBC, or MSNBC, and so on and so forth. All right. But again, what's really cool is as you click on these, it'll pull up the interview or whatever video clip that is. It'll show you exactly where it's at. And then you can see the text, right? So this is just really neat. You can see exactly how that's being used and discussed, all right? So a couple of big things to take away here, right? So first of all, we can see that timeline when QAnon kind of breaks the mainstream for cable news conversation and discussion. All right. And I think, again, that shows us no surprise, right? We can see this maximum moment where February 2021, we have, 31 minutes just in that month. And we're talking like straight within these little chunks, right? That's not like 31 minutes of total coverage. That is like in these little snippets of video. That's how much is happening. So let's take a look at that real fast, just so you can see, again, the volume of videos. So clips up to 3 minutes. Yeah, we've got 382. So that's a pretty big deal that explodes. And again, almost all of that is following January 6th. And in fact, we can even see January itself. We've got 27 minutes total coverage across these stations. So that is a significant amount of time. Now, here's where things get really interesting. And I went ahead and already did this search. But we can also add the stations and separate them out. And I think this is what gets helpful, right? So I did text, QAnon, and then CNN and Fox and MSNBC. So you can see I created that query right there. And take a look at the difference here in terms of coverage, right? And so what you're looking at is red is CNN, yellow is Fox, and green is MSNBC. All right. And I think right there, that's a pretty stark difference in terms of who is covering and who is talking about and the amount of time spent, right? Like, look at this peak here. CNN spent 20 minutes of that coverage. And again, it's probably more than what we're looking at here as well, right? Because the context can be bigger than just the word QAnon. They might be talking about a number of other things. But and even over here in early January, we're looking at 13 minutes CNN, 12 minutes MSNBC, and Fox, less than a minute. In February, just over a minute. And even March, not even quite 2 minutes yet. So again, I think that really speaks to the kinds of coverage that is provided by each of these cable TV news stations. And I think it feeds really well into a lot of our assumptions about what we know, and a lot of what we've already been learning about many of the networks and what they cover and why they cover it. And I'm going to jump now to another tool. And actually, I'll open up a new browser just so you can see it here. For those of you who are ever interested in what goes on behind the scenes in Google, there's a great tool called Google Trends that lets you search for different topics, right? And so in this case, I'm going to just type in QAnon, and I'll talk through what we're seeing here. So what Google Trends shows you is not the volume of searches. They will never tell you, unless you probably pay somebody to get behind the scenes or something like that at Google. But they never tell you exactly how many searches are being completed on each topic. But they do give you a sense of when they peak in popularity. All right, so what we're looking at right here is an index. And so we've got a timeline. This is a full year's worth of that timeline. And we can change that up. And interest over time shows us, again, when we hit peaks of interest with this topic. So QAnon hit a peak August 16 through 22 in 2020, and hit another one January 10 through 16, right? So the week right after the January 6th insurrection, we see that other peak right there. So it hit about 98% of the total that happened there in August, right? And two things were happening. Number one, we know that there's a lot of conversation, a lot of Q-related conversation related to the Republican convention, right, happening right there in August. And then the other thing, of course, is the January 6th insurrection. So what we're looking again are people searching just the word QAnon. And as we go through, we can start to see kind of the places where all these subregions, it gives us a sense of the places where it was a larger share or had a larger proportion of searches related to other searches, right? And I'll actually click on this just so you can see what they mean here. They'll see, it says, see in which location your term was the most popular during the specified time frame. So again, over the past year. And what this means is that on the scale of 0 to 100, 100 is the location with the most popularity as a fraction of the total searches in that location, right? So it's not necessarily like people were only searching for Q in Vermont, right? That's not what we're seeing here. But as a fraction of the total searches, it was the largest out of everything else people were searching for in Vermont. So they had the largest ratio of QAnon to other searches going there in terms of that phrase. So again, when we see Vermont coming out as number one, that doesn't mean that like the whole state was looking for QAnon content, right? Again, just to clarify, that means that the highest ratio of QAnon to other searches was happening in Vermont, and so on and so forth. And if you were really curious, you could really go into depth here. Like I could click on it and see it down by like county level, which is kind of interesting, right? And if you know anything about Vermont, I mean, that's the population center. I mean, everything else is really rural, so no surprise there, right? But anyway, as we go through that, there are other things that we can do. We can compare it with other terms. And I'm not going to necessarily do that in this case because some of them will be really skewed in terms of the search itself. But I think this is where things can get interesting, right? If you think like Google, right, what you're doing is what we might call pull marketing, right? Where the idea is that you're trying to get a sense of what are people naturally doing on their own? What are they out there searching for on their own? So if I'm thinking like, let's say a QAnon adherent, right? You're not going to just search QAnon. Like the rest of the world is also searching QAnon. That's a really noisy search that we did before. But if I'm somebody who's interested in QAnon and I'm a maybe a believer or follower or whatever, I might be searching what's the latest Q drop, right? And so maybe the search phrase QAnon drops would be something to look for. And that way we can get a better sense of what might be happening or where people are searching from. And so now we can see a very different perspective. If you remember before, we had those big swings, related to major national events. Here we're looking at some other let's see, what's the big one here? March 22 through 28. And I can't even remember what was happening at that point. Maybe some of you have a better memory. Oh, I mean, beginning of the pandemic, right? Of course, right? We're all kind of forgetting here, right? Beginning of the pandemic, right? And people are really looking for clarity about what's going on in the world. Of course, Q's going to have an answer, right? This pandemic means something. It's a conspiracy to drag down Trump or whatever, right? So that's when we see the largest volume is at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Super interesting. And then we can see, again, lately it's really faded away as those actual drops have kind of disappeared and fallen away as Q doesn't post anymore, or at least not in ways that we know of in the spaces that would have been pretty dominant. Now, here's where it also gets interesting. Remember before when I talked about those indices, we can get a really good sense of location. So again, here's where QAnon shows up as a larger ratio of other searches. All right, so this is where I think if anybody's wondering, like where do Q followers live? I mean, everywhere, of course, but where might be some of those concentrations, right? And I find this not surprising in the least bit, right? You can see this choropleth map. There's some spaces like Oklahoma, right? I mean, no surprise. Nebraska, Idaho, Oregon, because of the rural populations in Oregon, right? This all makes sense to me. Tennessee, Kentucky, right? And even Michigan to some degree, right? So no surprise from what we know of TV news and a lot of the organizing and what we know of even in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. Who are where a lot of these people getting picked up and arrested, and where are the centers of a lot of these groups. And as we keep going down, though, I think what's also helpful is Google will provide some additional information. What are the related searches, right? Like QAnon posts, for example, right? So not just Q drops, right? It would be Q posts, and we can even just add that maybe as another topic. So pretty well, actually, it's a little bit different. So people who search for Q post rather than Q drop have a different search going on. And there we can see the peak is January 10, right? And that's probably a different search. It's probably not QAnon adherence as much as people wondering about what has been said, what's going on about Q. What are the posts? Other people posting. What are people posting about Q? And we can see again those search ratios and so on and so forth. So I think that's a valuable set of tools, right? So again, first of all, we've got that Stanford cable TV news analyzer. And what we noticed, again, very different coverage in terms of the cable TV news networks. And then the other thing to consider, of course, are these Google tools that lets us think through those trends in different ways. And again, if you think like somebody who's doing a search, you can learn different things.
So any reactions to what Nathan just showed us?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, Nathan. Specifically for me was, of course, the marking of the different dates, right? But also those states, the locations. I found that really fascinating. And it's interesting, and it's kind of more of a personal story. Today, I heard from a former student of mine who's moved to Tennessee from ISU, and he was actually talking about the difficulty he's had there since moving from Illinois to Tennessee because of some of the people that he's around that he works with who were actually talking about some of these conspiracy theories, right? So, and that's in Tennessee. So I think that for me, that was really interesting to see, because it was like, it's difficult for me to know how to deal and how to talk to these people. And of course I said, well, just don't talk to them. But, it's really interesting to see that correlation now, right? With that high number in Tennessee. I think also, to me, speaks to, it's something I can get into a little bit later when I mentioned my interest in race with this, right? We also know, I would be interested in seeing a demographic breakdown. Now, we know in some of these states, that there's not going to be that many Black folk. So I'm assuming, who that demographic is. but it just kind of validates for me my whole thinking as I watch this documentary. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Anyone else on Nathan's data?
You know, I think that the data tells a particular story about why this narrative is so appealing to so many people. And especially, I think that, you know, when I was watching this documentary, and it's something I'll probably come back to as our conversation unfolds, but when I was watching this documentary, it brought me back to, I should say I've watched this series twice now. It brought me back to seminars I took in graduate school about propaganda. And I think that that's a theme that runs through this conspiracy, and it also runs through the HBO documentary, at least very, very much. And that is the question of this as sort of an extension of kind of psyops as informational warfare. And so I found myself rereading a specific French writer on propaganda from the 20th century, Jacques Ellul. And I found his insights to be very, very compelling when thinking about the QAnon phenomenon. But you know, I think that what is very telling here is, you know, this is a narrative that I think has sort of been around, but it takes particular kind of events that have a shock effect to really kind of dig in. And I think that when we see the data that you presented, it really tells us that. And the pandemic's an obvious kind of case here. But I think that that's the other thing that we have to kind of grapple with here is when we're trying to understand, you know, why is this so appealing to people? I mean, there's a number of explanations, but when you're dealing with people as kind of symbol using beings, as Kenneth Burke would put it, it's not surprising that people are going to use different narratives to try and ground themselves in a certain reality. And we have to take very seriously what kind of reality is possible when the world seems to be in chaos, right? And I think that the data that you presented really, for me, confirms that. And I think that, you know, if we're looking at this very dispassionately and critically, we have to really, I think the data tells a certain story that, at least for me, confirms what can guide an understanding as to what drives this narrative, what drives this phenomenon. And I think it helps us clarify potentially, well, what do you do to respond to it? So that's my immediate reaction to the data that you presented.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Steve, that you mentioned propaganda, because one of the things that I was thinking of, Nate, as you were walking through the data, especially the legacy media data, the Stanford TV data, is the work of Binkler and colleagues at the MIT lab that look at network propaganda. And they make a very compelling argument that our media ecosystem is built such, and this goes back decades, right? 30 years before the advent of social media, is built in such a way to facilitate these networks that spread propaganda, conspiracy, and facilitate the transmission of those messages in that way. So it's not surprising, right, to see that Fox News is not covering QAnon. They're covering that up, right? Potentially. I think that's what Binkler would argue. That's what they do argue in the book, that they're not going to show the negative side of that. They're going to try to whitewash that away, everything that happens with the insurrection, all of that. And we see that continue to this day. So I was really thinking, Scott, that your background is like the divide. It's perfect. This is the divide of our time. And the data that Nate showed is really a good example of that.
Just to build on that point, Steve, you're absolutely right. And I think that this is actually where, you know, you referenced the concept of the media ecosystem. And this is really where communication scholarship really, I think, has a lot to offer understanding this phenomenon. You know, because we do have to understand it as this kind of, you know, multi-layered system of information dissemination. And again, it really speaks to, in my mind, why you have to have humanities scholarship as sort of a bulwark against this kind of misinformation. And again, it's a complicated thing. And again, that's my immediate reaction to that. I think you're absolutely right. Putting that on the table immediately, we need to start there. So.
No, as a psychologist, I want to bring the sense of what it feels like to be part of one of these things. Not that I am part of one of these things, but I think there are quite a few similarities between what it feels like to be part of this group and what we all feel like when we're part of a project we really dig on, right? And maybe later I'll talk about, we do need to talk about the multi-scale historical conditions that made the American population, I would argue, particularly vulnerable to this type of phenomenon right now. The thing is, news reports have been with us for quite a while. What's, for me, I see being added to that in the last 20 years is the sense of agency that anybody can have now when they have access to the internet. I mean, it used to be the case that the vast majority of the population had nothing to do with the national news or even the local news because it was owned by corporations or states that controlled who was speaking. And now with the advent of the internet, 4chan, 8chan, all these channels that people can not just be passive in, but actually be agentic in. And when I watched, focusing primarily on the search for Q, listening to people talk about how robustly they believe these things and how robustly they participate in the spreading of this information, it was clear that, like, Shakespeare said, slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. If I'm moving in a direction, I can take the crap, I can take the complaints. So I think giving people having the opportunity to be agentic in this dissemination themselves, and then having these 4chan and 8chan where they actually compete to see who can generate the most obnoxious stuff, there's a huge sense of agency that comes. It's like shooting off an informational gun. If you get all these people responding, it's like boom. So bringing that into the mix just creates this, first of all, highly agentic, self-satisfying phenomenon that also becomes highly addictive, right? And so they call it a rabbit hole, and I think it's a rabbit hole of agency. And I think that agency is ironically sort of a democracy deselecting itself, right? I mean, giving everybody the opportunity to express their agency in this environment and seeing that, woof, here's what it leads to. So for me, looking at it that way, I will admit I find it terrifying, and at the same time, we've got to be part of that informational distribution space. Otherwise, yep.
Scott, to jump onto that point, one of the things that I'll teach in my classes on social media and internet culture and all of that really looks at, everything that you're just describing, right? Like this idea of belonging and community development, and what is it about online communities that can be extremely attractive to people. And a lot of that, like you're saying, being agentic is really connected to being able to do some sort of work that gives back to that community. And you talked a little bit about the competition, but that community work in the sense of making some sort of common good for that community reminded me a lot, like again, going into the Into the Storm documentary, right? There's a section on talking about all these layers of people on 4chan and later 8chan, right? The bakers, right? You've
Yes.
got like the posters, the bakers, the admins, right? And all of these layers. And immediately made me think of going back to my early days in grad school, of looking at Wikipedia as this like amazing new place where you've got this cohesive community of totally unrelated people coming together to make this really powerful and amazing thing. And the same kind of structures existed, right? You have like unregistered editors, and then admins, and then bureaucrats who can like do stuff, and like it just keeps going up these hierarchies, and that's just like such a human thing. I mean, it's like if we're thinking about what makes what defines people is probably the creation of bureaucracies more than anything else. Forget tool making. It's all about bureaucracy making. And I think we see that here, right? And even who's allowed to post and who has the right information and how that's negotiated. So in so many ways, I mean, it becomes a really easy thing to study and to look at from that lens, right? I mean, it just kind of falls into to place. But of course, the topic and the tone and the content is what becomes so, like you're saying, so terrifying. So in so many ways, this is like so typically human, but in other ways, yeah, totally horrifying.
Yeah, one thing. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to add on to the point. I mean, I referenced Jacques Ellul earlier, and your point, he says this. He says, I want to emphasize that the study of propaganda must be conducted within the context of a technological society. I mean, this is a very kind of mid-20th century terminology for describing this. But again, he's kind of like, this is these terms from social theory in, mid-20th century, where they're trying to name this kind of largely kind of mass bureaucratized society and the way it's integrated within a mass media, which is, again, at this time, kind of a new phenomenon. But it's fascinating to kind of think about this insight, 60 years later, with the digital era and the digital layers of this integration. He says this: propaganda is called upon to solve problems created by technology, to play on maladjustments, and to integrate the individual into a technological world. And I think if we really kind of let that sink in, what the purpose of propaganda is, according to Lul, is it integrates people into this new techno-social experience. And I think, again, we can look at this phenomenologically, but that's really, I think, what kind of brings these together here. And it's again, when watching these documentaries, you can't integrate into this reality without a certain technological means to do so, right? Kind of almost bringing back the ghost of McLuhan here. The medium is the message, right? I mean, I'm not sure if a QAnon phenomenon could take off like it is without the particular kind of digital media that are integrating people into it. And I think that, again, what's terrifying is that we're on the cusp of this transition in our digital era to an Internet of Things, right? Where AI is going to be much more integrated into the way we are. And I think that the problem is the technology is advancing and the system itself of integration is advancing faster than I think even those who are managing it can anticipate its effects.
Yep.
And that's the crisis, because, it's one thing to say that the economy or technology is moving faster than, say, the state can actually manage it or regulate it. That's always been a problem. But what's different in this era, at least as far as I can tell, is that, and I think you see this in these congressional hearings with Facebook and Google and and Twitter, is that this is moving faster than they can manage it. And
Totally.
that's we're in an uncharted territory in that sense, and I'm not sure what you all think about that, but that's, to me, like, speaks to the crisis of our era.
It kind of goes to the comment I made about the deselection of democracy, right? In the sense that the idea, everybody gets a voice. We've always had rules about what you get to say, right? There's always been liable. It's just falling apart in the face of everybody, Facebook in particular, right? Having access to these platforms. I am not at all trying to say don't do it or it should be legal, but Steve, I agree. We're in a situation we don't know how to manage. And I think we don't know how to manage because I think we have, I don't think we conceptualize the human condition in a way that allows us to. I mean, the liberal response to QAnon tends to be based on truth and facts, right? They're not telling the truth and we are. And the problem, that's just another binary. I mean, how many times have we been in meetings? I should say it that way. What I mean is by creating the divide around truth, the problem is what that does is deny the social enjoyment we get out of being with a group whose rhetoric we use. In other words, QAnon is a social group and it's got a hierarchy that makes people feel fulfilled by being part of it. And they're incredibly agentic, from pressing buttons on a computer to storming the Capitol. All of that is about doing things with your body in real time. And then when the left comes back and says, yeah, but the data are wrong, and if the data were right, they wouldn't be doing this, or if they listen to the data, that's just not true. I mean, if you look at the QAnon, the QAnon propaganda is they're killing kids. All right, that's once you go that route, you know that the rhetoric is about creating the abject other, right? And then creating a space for we to be not them. And if, when the rhetoric has to go that extreme, it's not about truth. It's not about information. It's about social belonging, social groups. And on the left, if the left doesn't acknowledge that its own structures of rhetoric are also embedded in a social group and is also about belonging, then I think the counter argument against QAnon is just going to fail, because the rhetoric is completely created to prevent the truth argument from mattering. No, we're the ones that are woke. I don't know how many times in the documentary I saw the QAnon folks saying we're waking up, right? And so the truth argument, I think, is, how to approach it. I'm just not sure that that's the one that's going to move us through it.
Yeah,
I got lots to say, but I'll defer to anybody who wants to respond.
well, let me start real quick. I think for me, one of the things that's troubling about this is the fact that, to me, that truth of QAnon is, and this is where I'm going to start talking about race issues. I think it's steeped in this notion of a fear of the loss of the power of whiteness, right? So I think
Completely agree.
I think it goes way beyond these two sides to really thinking about the ideology that's coming, that I think creates Q, right? I think there's a certain way that we have to look at Q as this. I mean, as I watched this, I kept thinking, boy, these, and I'll be honest with what I was thinking. I was like, oh my God, these white men are really silly, right? In the way they're thinking. And for me, it sounded just like this fear of losing their everything, right? That if we don't put out these types of, if we don't start thinking these certain ways and putting out these kind of messages, well, there goes the loss of white power, right? And so I guess I have to. I'm trying to think about a way to think about, really what these truths are on both sides. And I think you bring up a really good point, Scott, with talking about that, right? But I think there's something, that's just steering underneath there that we have to get at also with these messages. Because I mean, when I watched this again, I was looking at these, some of the messages that go on, or whatever they call them, that go on there on 8chan or 4chan or whatever they're called. I'll let all you technology people deal with that stuff. But I guess what troubles me is that, for me, there's something deep-seated about it that is, that goes beyond what they think, what they're trying to say is a truth. And I think what it is, and Scott, I've been wanting to have this conversation with you about this. Is this some kind of psychosis that we see in these people, right? These members. I think there's something that, I think there's a real fear, and I don't mean to be cynical, but I think there's a real fear in their thinking that there's going to be a loss of something for them, right? So when we think about civil rights movement, a big part of what angered white folks so much wasn't about giving equal rights to Black people under the law. It was about, what am I going to lose if I agree that they should have equal rights? This is going to take something away from me. This is going to take some property away from me. In other words, to me, all this speaks to the notion of the horrific things that have been done in this country to maintain power, to maintain a hold on power. And I think the message is, from what I see from Q, and by the way, I'll just say this now. I sent a message to you all the other evening saying there's some really disturbing things going on with this now, right? So Nathan, you mentioned earlier there's hardly any messaging going out. Well, because Q is rebranding themselves right now, right? And the rebranding is not to be QAnon, but the rebranding is to get into the school systems, to start running for elections, right? To start running for offices. That's the new thing. So I don't know if we'll hear that much about QAnon in the next year or so. Their interest now is, let's get on the school board so we can stop CRT, what they think is CRT. Let's run for offices like Marjorie Taylor Greene, so we can start indoctrinating what we want as legislation into the government. So I think it's becoming more dangerous than it is now. And I would just say, I think Q is dangerous. I think that whole movement is very dangerous. And so I think it's moving. And so I wonder how that moves our conversation then from this notion of, what's going on with social media, because I think they're going to move it beyond now this social media. Social media, I think, was a start off point for this, right? To get this ideology out there. So what happens now? I mean, what needs to be the argument now, or the way we're talking about this? Is that shift now? Because I found that's the thing I found really interesting, Nathan, when you were showing that data, that drop off, right? At the end of that, the drop off on those charts. So what is that telling us now, right? So are we moving beyond this social media phase of this into something more direct with human interaction?
I just want to quickly respond to your comment on agency, or on mental health, mental illness. The thing is, I think what we're witnessing in these people is the same thing we witness in other people every day. And that is that you're absolutely right. They're terrified of the deconstruction of whiteness. This is honestly how I experience it. And what they do is generate a rhetoric that gives them a cognitive turn. It's like reading Lovecraft, right? It gives them a turn away to look at something else. It creates a villain. It creates an abject other. And what that does is put them first, it puts them in a space of feeling right, which is incredibly psychologically, this is not going to sound right, but it's psychologically healthy to feel like you're doing things that are good, right? And that's how the rhetoric's built. We are good because we are resisting this elite pedophiles that sacrifice kids. I mean, all of that is there to make people feel like they're doing something good. And it's all done to turn the camera away from other things, right? To create an abject other that focuses their energies in ways that allows them to ignore the trauma of those that are marginalized and those that they are ignoring. So I think we're seeing normal everyday behavior that is just incredibly amplified through the agency of the internet. And your comment about going out into the world, they're already here. Jay McGonigal has a fantastic book called Reality's Broken: Why Video Games Make Us Better People. And what she shows is the gamification available in video games, the ability to manipulate the relationship between my behaviors and the outcomes, can create addictive situations that keep me embedded in some kind of problem space. That's exactly for me, that's exactly why this works. They're pressing buttons, they're expressing agency. And in the Search for Q, they talked about gamifying it, right? To get people addicted, and putting it out into the world is just the next step in agency. So I suspect there's a long haul being undertaken here. I said I was going to speak for 30 seconds. I apologize, but I just wanted to get all that out.
I think that's a really interesting point. I know Nate and I have been talking about that issue. There's some communication scholars at Clemson University that have been analyzing data in the social web, and they talk about the gamification of Q. And they say, hey, what's the solution? Well, we just need to teach people to be better critical thinkers, right? No, right? Because they think when they're in this game that they are engaging critical thinking. They are looking at these drops from Q. They're putting pieces of data together and making generalizations and claims. They're looking at what Trump says and his body movement, and they're finding all of this evidence that connects all of the dots. It's that pseudo critical thinking that is addictive, but really, really, really dangerous. Because they think you're right. I'm sure that many of them get happiness out of it, and they feel like they're doing the right thing. They're fighting pedophilia and keeping the Democrats and celebrities from eating babies.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Nathan, go ahead, please.
I wanted to dive in on a couple of those points. I think first to follow up with what Byron was saying about school boards and kind of the shift of this movement into local politics and all that. And as you all know, I was at one of our local school board meetings, kind of when all the CRT.
Nate is a local hero.
When all the stuff was flying around, I had to speak some piece. But anyway, looking around the room at some of the signs that people brought in, there was this clear melding of and again, the topics weren't only CRT. The other things coming up were sex ed policies and masking and like all of this like public health stuff. And it was very clear from the language being used, because they would come up and scream at the school board about pedophiles teaching sex ed. And it was like, boom, right there. That's your central QAnon argument for why certain things can't be done in schools. They're going to start preying on our kids, right? So I definitely saw that happening. And I think to respond to some of the other thoughts that have been out there, I drag me back in here after like a minute if I keep going long, but I've got a lot to pack in here real quick. So one of the things that Steve Rahko was mentioning about Elul and propaganda and technology, I would turn to another philosopher and theorist to think about some of the structures that are going on technologically. And that's Gilles Deleuze, who is better known for working with Felix Guattari, and very difficult postmodern, sometimes impenetrable work. But he had some really coherent interviews towards the end of his career and the end of his life. One of which is in a great book called Negotiations. And one of the last chapters of that book is called Postscript on a Control Society. And he's got this great theory about different types of societies that have emerged, not necessarily around technology, but around basically like diagrams of organization, right? And so like he talks about like classically, like humanity was controlled by sovereign societies, right? You've got a king or an oligarchy that kind of dictates things, everybody follows that. And then step two is we move into, and these aren't like necessarily linear progression, but they're just kind of changes. We've got disciplinary societies, right? We all know that from Foucault. Anybody who studies Foucault knows the idea of discipline and punish, right? Like all of our modern agencies and institutions look like prisons and schools and jails, and it's all about subjecting the body to confinement. And then he says, the one we're well, he wrote this or talked about this in the late 90s, but he said the one we're moving into, and that the one that we're obviously in now, is a control society. And the idea is that it's control in terms of technologies and communication streams that are controlled by passwords and networks, right? And what I found and I still to this day find incredibly interesting is the scholarship that's taken off kind of out of those propositions about this control society. A lot of network theory kind of looks at this and talks about, again, these shifts from, like centralization to decentralization to distributed networks, right? And that's where we see social media really come into play. It's not a decentralized network. It is everybody's kind of interconnected in a really ugly web. Again, just like we're seeing behind you, Scott, with all those hashtags from members of Congress, it's this really distributed web. And that brings about lots of again, uncertainty and disruption. And a lot of that is what we call asymmetrical, either communication, or I think, as we're all talking about tonight, is more or less asymmetrical cultural warfare, right? We're talking about a pretty sophisticated, not centralized, again, very decentralized group that's
Yes.
able to infiltrate into so many things in a very asymmetrical way. And that's typically how asymmetrical networks, and again, I'm not comparing QAnon people to terrorists here, but people who do network studies like Eugene Thacker and Alex Galloway, they wrote a great book called The Exploit. They talk about this asymmetry that's used by terrorist networks, right? Like you find exploits in the central powers that be, and you use your network of agents to undermine them. You blow up buildings, you blow up cars, you just cause disruption, right? 9/11, all you have to do is fly into a building and you'll cause a country to cripple itself for the next 20 years, right? You know, and QAnon to me is capable of very similar things through that disruption, utilizing networks, right? And here's where I'm going to back off just one moment and then say, all right, here's what Deleuze kind of proposed that I think, again, that people who are doing network studies, you know, recently have also kind of thought about. Deleuze said, when you're in a control society, right, like it feels like it is completely overwhelming. Like there's nothing you can do if you don't have the right, you know, card or the right password to get through something. And he says, we've got to find circuit breakers, right? That's the next step. You have to find the circuit breakers. And people doing, again, these network studies talk about this idea of exploits, right? Like Q found the exploit in so many of our systems, right? The gamification and articulation to existing power structures and religion and the religious right and all of that, right? So the response then is, what is a symmetrical response back, or you know, a larger response, right? And what are the circuit breakers going to be for those of us who see this now as a tremendous you know, threat to society and you know, anti-democracy, right? What is the effective response? What are going to be those circuit breakers?
The irony is that QAnon thinks it's the circuit breaker. It's built into the rhetoric. We're the ones who are dismantling this conspiracy, and we're the ones that are waking you up and bringing you this truth. And for me, again, I've told you before, I look at rhetoric as living systems, and this living system has adapted to this environment incredibly well, in the sense that the rhetoric entails arguments against any possible assault on their notions of truth. Their notions of right and wrong, their notions of goodness are all baked into the cake of their rhetoric. And it's a rather robust network. And so at the moment, I don't want to speculate on how to deal with it. I want us to keep talking about our stuff. I just want to say one more thing about the emergence of QAnon becoming this big thing. One thing that I hope we learn from this as we look at the data, kind of the data that Nate's available to create for us, is that it can feel like this was all a plan. But in the search for Q, their ending argument was that a couple people made this as a parody of Trump fans and got it into these boards, and people took it seriously and then started reorganizing it into an intentional phenomenon. And then others at other levels, higher levels, saw the potential and, you know, weaponized it in a professional way. So the point here is it's a tornado, right? That organizes itself spontaneously and then with some intention over time, and trying to, you know, say where was the intention really kind of works against understanding that it's, like you said, it's just a self-sustaining network. And yeah, I'll stop there.
No, these are brilliant insights, and you know, I love Deleuze as well. And so I'm glad you brought Deleuze into the picture, and that essay too. It's so illuminating so many years later, and I think that, you know, what your remarks also reminded me of another theorist who's still with us at Annenberg, Manuel Castells, in the mid 90s, in his first book on the network society, right? When, you know, it's like Deleuze is coming up with the control society around the same time that Castells is beginning to kind of advance his own understanding of this. And there's always been a part of that first book in his trilogy on the Network Society that I found very compelling, and it stuck with me because you mentioned 9/11, and this was published like 5 years before 9/11, but I think it really kind of explains it. And I think that, when we're thinking about this circuit breaker and what's at stake here, one of the things that we have to grapple with this network society, with this digital era of interconnectedness, is that as we become more interdependent, Castells tells us, it empowers the smaller actors. There's a certain irony at play, right? We generally think about, power as something that is sort of hierarchical. It's coming from these big players like, the corporation or the state. But the more interdependent we become, the more agency actually is taken on by those who, are at least in theory less powerful, because they can find that intersection and they can exploit it. And I think that that's in part what you're seeing. Now, again, one of the things that becomes interesting and also disturbing about the QAnon phenomenon is the way in which it intersects with these figures from the military realm. So you think about Flynn, for instance, General Flynn. One of the characters that's introduced also in the HBO series in episode 5 is this figure in the intelligence arena. And there's this scene where the documentary filmmaker's on the phone outside in episode 5. And this, I'm going to find the guy's name, but the name is evading me, but he basically says that, and again, we don't know if he's telling the truth, but that's, again, what part of what comes with the territory with this kind of informational warfare, this kind of psychops. This is this character who's kind of known for these psychops, and he works with Flynn. And he basically says, we're helping feed intelligence to Q. And he's basically talking about these rogue intelligence services that are basically working outside of the government because they think the CIA is against Trump. And that's the thing that becomes, again, part of the story of this phenomenon is the privatization of the military. I think that another way of thinking about the QAnon phenomenon is that it's not so far removed from, say, like the Blackwater stuff we saw during the War on Terror during the Bush years. It's not far removed from the privatization of the military. And again, I can't help but, since Donald Rumsfeld just passed away, I mean, we're living in the kind of the legacy of these decisions. And that's the other thing that's very disturbing too, is that you do have this proliferation of security services, of intel services, that, and again, you think about the 2016 election and the Steele dossier. I mean, these are all kind of private networks where people with these kinds of techniques are selling them to the highest bidder. And that's also part of the world that we're in. And I think that brings a certain layer or a certain kind of a level of alarm to the control society that we're in. Is that it's almost like the control society depends on and is in there's a kind of adjacency to this intelligence kind of mercenary cult. And I mean, cult's not the right word, but there is a certain kind of mercenary element to this. There is a certain kind of privatization and neoliberalization of military services that also makes this possible. And again, it's a huge threat to any kind of stable liberal democracy. And the fact that these information flows are global, that we're at a point where, I mean, according to what we've seen with Biden's relations with Putin, where they're just now starting to come up with some kind of ground rules about cyber warfare. I mean, we don't even know about a lot of the cyber warfare that goes, but this is all part of this kind of new era that we're grappling with. And again, it's alarming to the extent that we're not. I mean, it's easy to kind of look at the spectacle and kind of the buffoonery of QAnon, but it's made possible by all these other deeper developments that are kind of shifting the ground under which we exist. And if we don't have a democratic response,
No.
You know, something after QAnon, I mean, if one thing is QAnon, if it's being rebranded, that's one thing, but there's just going to be another conspiracy narrative that again, based on all the kind of available psychographic profiles that one can glean from these networks, that you could just manufacture another narrative and just use the same old tropes and have different villains.
Yep.
And I think that's why it's so important to have this conversation.